Progress. All right. Hello, everyone. We have some folks in the room, a lot of folks on the Zoom. Really glad you're joining us today. Welcome to the Collabinar. My name is Ryan Meyer. I am the Executive Director of the UC Davis Center for Community and Citizen Science. And before I pass it off to the folks running the event today, I just want to say a little bit about our center. We are focused on a broad range of approaches to public participation in science. And our mission is to help scientists and communities collaborate on science to address environmental issues. So we are supporting that. We're also conducting research on it and developing resources and tools. So we've gathered a wide variety of participants for our Collabinar today, and we would love to know about you if you're on the Zoom, and we invite you in the chat. Just introduce yourself, share your name, position or title or organization or other affiliation. It'd be great to just get a sense. And thank you again for being here. So before we dive in, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are gathered. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of the Patwin people. And today there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: the Kachildehi Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzaldehi Wintun Nation, and Yochadehi Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah Angulo, who will explain a bit more about how this event will run. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, I'm Sarah. I'm the Community Education and Outreach Specialist here at the center, and I'm one of the coordinators for the Collabinar series events. We have Kelsey, who is helping us out this quarter. She's been awesome. Shout out Kelsey. So about our Collabinars, they invite colleagues from across the globe to present their most exciting developments and challenges in the field of community and citizen science. So attending the Collabinar today are people who are engaged with community and citizen science at different levels, as we're kind of seeing now through the chat. And so this 1-hour session aims to foster an environment of mutual learning. It's less a formally structured webinar as it is a discussion on the topic or project brought to us by the presenter. And so throughout this time together, I'll monitor the chat where you should feel free to put your thoughts and questions. We'll answer anything pressing as we go along, but we will have plenty of time for an open discussion at the end. And as you may have noticed, this meeting is being recorded, so the link will be added to the website, and then we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as well. And so I'm going to pass it over now to Jada to introduce our presenter.
Hi, good morning, everyone. We are so excited to have Rosalie here with us today. And my name is Jada Miller. I am a graduate student in the School of Education here at UC Davis, and I work here at the Center for Community and Citizen Science. And so I have the pleasure today of introducing Rosalie. Rosalie is a doctoral candidate in the Division of Society and Environment in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. Their PhD advisor is Alistair Isles, and they are a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. Rosalie is broadly interested in the processes through which historically white land-grant universities envision and enact and inhibit organizational change to improve anti-racist and decolonial outcomes in their agri-food systems education. Rosalie is uses an interdisciplinary lens of critical and abolitionist university studies, organizational sociology, critical theories of race, settler colonialism and whiteness, and critical pedagogy of agri-food systems. Their dissertation is tentatively titled Anti-Racist and Decolonial Organizational Change, Work in Agricultural Higher Education, and it uses a mixed methods case study of UC Berkeley's College of Natural Resources, which is the university's land-grant arm. It includes 130 in-depth interviews, content analysis of organizational artifacts, participant observation, and visual examination of physical spaces. Rosalie's inquiry is guided by the epistemological and methodological principles of activist scholarship in higher education. And I had the pleasure of meeting Rosalie last October with my advisor, Dr. Heidi Ballard, who couldn't be here today. And so we're just so grateful to have Rosalie share more about their work with us. So welcome, Rosalie.
Thank you, everyone. Really grateful to be here. I guess I genuinely look at the green light up there. It's not the
Yes.
best to see.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
Okay, I give a special thanks to Jada for the invitation, also to Sarah and Kelsey for doing so much to make me feel welcome and prep for this event. So it's really good to be here. I study UC Berkeley's land grant on, but of course Davis and Berkeley are deeply intertwined as the University of California as a historically white land grant institution, which is the term that I name historically white in my dissertation because usually we don't name that. But Davis was, of course, as you know, originally a field station at UC Berkeley, so parts of my dissertation do kind of wander into Davis as well. The project that I'm talking about today is actually, two of the chapters of my dissertation are focused on interventions at UC Berkeley that are actually trying to address racism in agricultural education there. And so this is work that is one of those interventions. And it's one that I actually did before I became a student. It continued into my student life, but before I became a student, I was a staff person at UC Berkeley for 13 years, and the last 9 of those were as the program manager at the Berkeley Food Institute. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. Like we started today with the land acknowledgement, just a little bit of positionality statement. I am a very Bay Area raised white settler of refugee origin, and I work and live on the lands of the Wakama and Confederated villages of Lisan in the East Bay. I am also, that's the one-line version of my dissertation. I'm also a visual artist, and every way I think about education and community work always involves being an artist as well. And I think that's probably why I ended up doing a mapping project, even though I'm not a geographer. So I just feel like I can't talk about my positionality without also talking about being an artist. This is a crop that is grown a lot in California, but it's not of Californian origin. Hopefully all of our hearts are of Californian origin if we are living here. So today I'm going to be talking about the UC Berkeley Foodscape Mapping Project, which we'll get into. But first I want to frame what are universities, right? This talk is really looking at the project through the lens of organizational change. I know there had been a couple of links to articles that were in the Collabinar introduction, and maybe that's something that at some point we can drop in the chat. But those articles really looked at this project from a lens of critical pedagogy and agri-food systems pedagogy. And now this talk is based on a book chapter that's currently under review that looks at the same project from a lens of organizational change. And we don't often put these two together, but I thought it would be a really interesting conversation to have with you all as citizen scientists to think about how these things can work together. So universities are complex organizations that perform a lot of functions beyond the stated mission, which is usually around like knowledge production, right? And knowledge production is carried out through teaching and research and public service. Those are the pillars that we always hear. But Baldwin, in his amazing book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, also talks about universities as employers, as real estate agents, as police forces, as healthcare systems. There are all these things that universities do. And one of the things that they do is the foodscapes, right? That really structure the food choices that we have and also the food possibilities, right? And so I'm trying to frame how we think about universities beyond these kind of pillars that we usually put as part of knowledge production. And campus foodscapes are more than just the food available to eat on campuses. That's one part of it. The foodscape concept kind of originally came from landscape, but there's various different definitions of it. But in the writings that my advisor, Alistair Isles, and I have done about for this project, we've kind of landed on a definition of it as entities that make up food-related learning and practice, encompassing but not limited to teaching, research, student groups, activism, administrative decisions and initiatives, support services, campus gardens, dining services, eateries, catering, and other procurement, right? So all of these are different parts of ways that we think and interact with food on our campuses. And each of these functions, whether they're teaching endeavors or employment decisions or food procurement, operate through systems of deeply entrenched power that typically remain really invisible and unquestioned because it's just part of how universities run, right? And so we propose that Foodscape mapping, based on experience of doing this for 6 years, is a way that we can kind of unveil some of how that power operates in the university. And if we really do it through a lens of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, I'm using the acronym JEDI. It's one that because I say discourse a lot, in my own dissertation, I'm really using the terms anti-racist and decolonial kind of front and center, but the point that I was doing this project, those were not the words that we were using for the project. So I'm sticking with the JEDI acronym because it kind of reflects what we were using at the time, especially in 2015 when we launched the project. It was funded originally through the Division of Equity and Inclusion, UC Berkeley. It's gone through many name changes since then, but so just to acknowledge the language that I'm going to be using in this talk is JEDI. So when we look at campus foodscapes through a JEDI lens, we can really expose how power operates in these ways that racialized, gendered, and heteronormative and ableist workings of organizational power really play out in the food system, along with all these other intersectional identities. Those are the ones that we really ended up highlighting in the project. So what was this project? From 2015 to 2021, the Foodscape Mapping Project was this democratically produced interactive digital map that offered really extensive data on structural factors in the UC Berkeley Foodscape that were affecting JEDI issues and also celebrating wins where things were going well. It was created through community workshops and student research and visual and auditory design. We're not getting the auditory part and the interactive part with this with my still slides, but the map itself was very interactive. So it both revealed barriers to full participation by minoritized communities on campus and then also celebrated places where things were going better. So this is a detail of what's called the geographic asset map that also had a mobile app version that students developed, but it's all of these different resources you can see on the left on campus. So this is just like where to find things. And then each one of these icons, when you pulled them up, showed a bunch of detail about what those resources were. The map involved 2 full systems maps. That was one. This one is called All the Players. That was really a power map that I'll go into a little bit more later, but really showed just who are all of the people involved in the campus foodscape. The map also had 18 spotlight maps that were focused on specific issues, and I'll show some examples of those, but they were broadly, as we kind of put them together and see what are the connections between them, we realized that some of them were about academic units, some were about campus facilities, some were about service units, and some were about student activism and leadership. And those are kind of the 4 nodes of the foodscape that we kind of decided to focus on, or ended up realizing that we had focused on. So beyond the map as a product, the Foodscape Mapping Project was really a pedagogical and participatory research project to try to catalyze justice-oriented agri-food systems learning. So over the 6 years, there was 38 core undergraduate and graduate fellows who participated in in-depth research and coursework. And then over 130 additional students participated in data collection and data visualization that kind of on smaller aspects, kind of dipping in and out of the project. There was also over 20 professional staff members that engaged in long-term projects, mostly related to activism, mostly as volunteers. And then there was 5 faculty who were kind of long-term parts of the project. Alistair Isles being kind of the primary PI. He was the faculty director of the Berkeley Food Institute, where I was staff, and that's how that relationship developed. And then we had over 2,500 members of the campus that dipped in at different times, either doing surveys as part of data collection or going to events. So it really was like that we were doing crowdsourced data collection. It really was kind of this broad participation over many years. And I think the links that Sarah dropped in the chat kind of talk more about the project if you want to read about it. So I'm just going to show some slides kind of so that you know what we're talking about. Again, all of these are like interactive. It was all student, there was one professional cartographer involved who was a PhD student in cartography at the time, who did the last two maps I showed. He did much more of the kind of like sophisticated infrastructure development, but the rest of this was all student web development and student animation. So some of it's really quirky and wonderful, and each one's completely different, which was part of the premise. We didn't have a fixed idea about what maps were, right? And in the articles about it, we talk about kind of critical cartography and mapping. I myself am not a cartographer. So this was an oral history project that was all interviews with students of color who were involved in the multicultural community center, and it was the person who did the interviews. After the interviews, kind of did watercolor portraits inspired by each of the stories, and then those audio portraits that go with them. This is one a group, and I don't know if Natalie, if you made it to the call, say a hey in the chat. She is now staff at, both Natalie Munoz and Natalia Samara are both now staff at Berkeley as undergraduate students. They worked on this project. We looked at 110 years of coursework at UC Berkeley. Looking back at old course catalogs, a lot of these old ones were actually taught at Davis on the fund. And looking at kind of discourse used throughout the food classes, what was being taught. So in the 1920s and through 1930s, eugenics was taught as part of hygiene in the nutritional science classes. So that is part of our history, and this was kind of like a timeline that traced kind of 110 years worth of what has food and ag studies been at UC Berkeley. This was a really amazing project that was based on an undergraduate honors thesis that Jenna Shelton did about accessibility at field stations where the actual food and agriculture like lab classes are taught, and the fact that none of them met ADA regulation, but it looked both at physical barriers and also knowledge and financial barriers for students with accessibility needs trying to access field classes to complete majors related to food and agriculture and what these food systems might have. This was a map about all of the campus gardens, of which there's many. They're spread out all over our urban area, and we looked at them in terms of like, so the big green circles are based by size, but then we did another one based where you could rearrange the map looking at food production. So like the UC Botanical Garden is the biggest physical garden, but there's no food production there, right? So you could look at this map in different ways. There's been more gardens that have arisen since this map was made. This is a neat map that was telling the story of how food came from some of the production gardens to the food pantry on campus. So that was something else. This was a project looking at microwaves accessible on campus for students that lived off campus and were bringing food from home, and where and when they can heat up food and kind of meet the food needs that way, where the microwaves were concentrated on campus. We also tracked every single drinking fountain on campus, and to the super contemporary ones to like these old ones that honestly look like urinals. You're like, is that drinking fountain? So like the range across campus, and you can imagine that the fancy ones were in like the computer science buildings, and like in like kind of these kind of class differences among majors, right?
Mm-hmm. Whoa, yeah.
So this was an amazing project we did for almost 2 years in the fraternities and sororities, which were just this like kind of black box of not knowing what the food systems were like. 10% of Berkeley undergraduates are part of Greek life, and so we did a lot of interviewing and surveying around what food access looked like and what food needs were of students living in the sororities, and there was massive gender differences between expectations and access. And also these had intersections around race and class in terms of who had access to food in different ways. And it was amazing. It was all led by students that were involved in Greek life. So those are not all 18 of the spotlight maps. So I just wanted to give you a little sprinkle so you kind of, when we're talking about Foodscape mapping, kind of what this even looks like. So this is a slide from one of our first public presentation of an early stage of the map. These were students, map makers who've been, this is a master's student, PhD student, and undergrad actually, together talking about the map. That's Dennis in the middle. showing off an early stage of what then became the campus food players map that in its final form looked very different than it looked at this stage. But I show this to be that a key component of the Foodscape mapping project was thinking about pedagogy in creative ways, right? So I was a staff person at the Berkeley Food Institute, that is an interdisciplinary research center that's housed between 8 different colleges and divisions on campus, so not a teaching department. And part of what was really amazing about this project was how we could leverage different learning structures that were outside of conventional coursework to really provide hands-on education. And so this included a mix of like fellowships that we had through the center, many of which I paid for through the UC, the Global Food Initiative at different times. I know each campus got money, so I was kind of funneling those like undergrad and master's PhD fellowships into this project. And then we did have students gain coursework credit through both the food systems minor kind of community engagement program that's part of our minor, and then also through we have like undergraduate research apprenticeship programs at Berkeley that Davis maybe has as well. But we kind of had people toggling back and forth between like paid opportunities and coursework credit, and tried to have these kind of flexible opportunities, and that it was a mix of undergraduate, master's, and PhD students all working together on this project, sometimes directly with each other and sometimes disparate, but that was quite unusual because usually those populations don't interact outside of like TAs and undergrads being the master relationship, but here they were peers working on the project together. So across the 6 years, students joined just some of the departments that people came from in the fields: sociology, geography, society and environment, which is the program I'm in, environmental economics and policy, public policy development practice, public health, nutritional sciences, environmental science, molecular and cell biology, urban studies, city and regional planning, and American studies was some of the majors that students drew from. So critical pedagogy and activist research, I'm sure everyone involved in the center thinks about these concepts a lot, so I wanted to flag kind of some of the theorists and frameworks that we have used when writing about the project. I will say, so I started a PhD in 2019 while continuing to work close to full-time in my staff job for my first 3 years of the PhD. So I stopped working at the Food Institute in 2022. But so in 2019, when I became a grad student myself, I started, like spewing theory like the best of us. So I will now spew theory, but I will say that from 2015 until 2019, when I started grad school, I was doing this really by the seat of my pants, not using theory at all, just being like, I am a get shit done program manager, and this is what we do. Mm-hmm. And so that is part of why the language around this project has changed quite a bit, is because as I myself has developed as an academic, I've started using frameworks that before I was just like, how do I use my skills as a program manager to wiggle around the university? So I want to acknowledge that, because while I do identify as an academic now, I feel like I want to both uplift staff and the important role that staff play in these kinds of projects to actually create change, and also to acknowledge that like theory isn't everything. That's not how we come to know things always, right? And it was actually kind of, I maybe should have said this at the beginning, but I was showing Jada earlier that how I became a grad student was a little bit that from doing this project, Alistair and I had worked together. He had been one of the founding faculty directors at the Food Institute, and when he was among the team that hired me for the staff position, I only had a BA, and after many years working on the project, he was like, "You do realize you're an academic, right?" And I was like, "Oh, no." And then he finally convinced me to actually apply to the PhD program, and I started PhD when I was 40, kind of after having done professional life for a long time. So that's a little backtrack to the beginning, but I think as I was looking at all these citations, I was like, let's be a little more real here. So I now use lots of citations. But yeah, some of these theories might be familiar to folks in the space. Freire's kind of foundational work around critical pedagogy is something that we all use, and all of the people identify as critical pedagogy folks kind of working since Freire's time, but really this idea of problem posing education and praxis and going through layers of theory and activity back and forth, and what do we learn? The other piece of that is that the philosophy of it, before I was citing Gutierrez, who's Chris Gutierrez, amazing education scholar at Berkeley, and her like living in the food space, I was thinking, yeah, obviously students are like they are authoritative producers of knowledge from their own lived experience. Like, how do we draw on this to really both pose the questions we're asking, but also that is data, right? Since starting school, I really have resonated with Morales Doyle's theory around justice-centered science pedagogy, which he's working in the K through 12 space, but it's a framework for addressing dominant scientific education's historical role in reproducing social inequities, and really it builds on critical pedagogy and Lansing Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy to really center justice in all science projects. So while some of this, I'm a social scientist, I guess that's STEM enough, and some of these projects in the Foodscape mapping project really were using kind of more biophysical data collections while we were weighing produce, how much food is the campus really producing, things like that. So so we're really thinking about like the justice-centered scientific pedagogy theory really thinks about creating transformative intellectuals out of your own kind of lived experience. On the kind of more activist research side, I'm really thinking about both Hale's work on that, on how do you be both an activist and a scholar at the same time, and then really drawing on community-based participatory research practices that take many names and many forms. But these processes are really aimed at co-learning and capacity building and empowerment of participants, which in some ways we were focusing primarily on students, but as I said, a lot of university staff got involved in this project as well, and then also faculty, so not limiting who the populations are that we count as learners. This is a project of one of our early workshops. Before we decided to do mapping, we actually started with a series of workshops in 2015, like we were bringing together different folks that self-identified as food people at Berkeley from really across campus, being like, well, what do we need to do to address, at the time using the words equity and inclusion, because that's where our funding came from, in the campus food system. And it was out of this series of workshops that we decided to even undergo a mapping project. So I would say this kind of these methods of participatory pedagogy like led to what we did rather than the other way around. So in 2021, Alistair and I interviewed 8 student fellows who had been really kind of among those close to 40 in-depth folks who worked on the project to really understand what did folks learn, kind of what learning happened from this project. And after kind of hearing what folks were saying, we really settled on Engelstrom's theory of expansive learning to describe this. And this is a theory that talks about learning in the unknown. That is, the problem isn't like set out before you undertake the learning, but through the process of undergoing a learning process, you kind of realize what it is you're trying to define and learn. And that fits really well for this idea of like identifying what the campus foodscape even is. So, so a quote from Engelstrom about what expansive learning is people in the organizations are all the time learning something that is not stable, not even defined or understood ahead of the time. In important transformations of our personal lives and organizational practices, we must learn new forms of activity which are not yet there. They are literally learned as they are being created. He's coming from CHAT, culturally historic activity theory. Yes, so that Vygotsky tradition. And what I like about Engelstrom is he bridges individual learning with organizational learning. So as I pivot next into thinking about organizational change, he becomes kind of a key person. I did this drawing of kind of the different types of learning that the students reported from participating in the project, and was inspired by flight maps when I drew this. This was after the fact when we were writing about the project. So I do want to switch gears to think about organizational change, right? Because this is not often included in critical pedagogy. And one of the things that is interesting is I feel like both Friday and critical, like kind of all the way going back to Friday and then critical pedagogy and activist research traditions, they make a pretty strong claim that they lead to transformative change, right? That like doing this kind of education transforms individuals, transforms society. But they kind of get really murky about the actual change part. and don't draw a lot on organizational theory or social movement theory and talking about it. And Freire is actually used a lot in social movement theory. So it's not that they're separate, but when we are trying to be like, what did this project do? Like in terms of actually changing the campus landscape, the foodscape, this is where Alistair and I started kind of digging a little bit more into organizational theory. And so these are some of the theories that we are using. And this is drawing from this, this chapter that's currently under review for an edited volume out of the University of Toronto Press about campus food, the learning food campus food landscapes. People are writing about all kinds of things for it, but this is what our chapter is. So, social symbolic work is a little bit of a funky theory that these theorists Philip and Lawrence developed that I really like. It sees organizations as these unstable entities that are constantly being produced and reproduced all the time. So universities are this type of organization. And this work happens through a combination of discursive work, discourse, relational work, relationships between everyone in the organization, and material processes, and that are all performed by all the participants in the organization, right? So they use the term social symbolic objects to represent these different parts of the organization. So that's everything from strategy to culture to initiatives, programs, policy, physical spaces, the identities of the people involved in the organization's beliefs. And everyone who participates in the organization is constantly doing this kind of work to create and change the organization all the time. And they're either creating it, they're maintaining it, or they're disrupting it, right? There's like these different relationships we have to organizations. And it really draws on social skill, but then also your different positionalities in relation to power in the organization. So that's what that theory is. Strategic action is a related theory. They argue also, Flickstein is actually at Berkeley, they also argue that that organizations are inherently unstable. We kind of maintain them all the time in this kind of like wiggly way. I'm wiggling here. And I'm the organization that no, our bodies are kind of like that too, right? We have lots of species in our bodies that are working together, vying for power. So they see these organizations where members are kind of either agree on taking for granted vision of what the organization should do, but rather than everyone actually being in agreement, they're fundamentally contentious by nature. And they name social actors as either being incumbents, those are like the power holders, or governance units, those are the folks that like enforce rules that usually side with the power holders, but not always, like the rule makers, the rule enforcers, and then challengers. And the challengers are the ones that are like pushing against the organization, right? And they do that through strategic action to try to change the organization. So these two sets of authors really theorize about how individuals and organizational subgroups are always working to define and change the organization itself, such that their values are the ones that are legitimate and prioritized, right? And this is where we go back to the concept of hegemony that really comes from critical social theory by Gramsci, right? So hegemony is the idea of what common sense is. So usually the common sense of an organization is the common sense of those in power, but challengers can try to make their common sense known in an organization, right? So, and the challengers are usually the ones whose worldviews and bodies and knowledges are marginalized by the organization. And so as they're working to perform kind of an alternative vision, they're trying to make their alternative values hegemonic, right? So the Foodscape Mapping Project is an example of challengers really identifying problems within UC Berkeley as an organization, and then performing this kind of social symbolic work or strategic action across a wide array of different objects within the organization to really try to push it towards JEDI. And so just to ground this, they, if this could be anything from like showing the lack of resources available to students with disabilities, trying to take, classes at the field stations. So resources is an object they were trying to change, to really changing the discourse. I didn't show an image of this map, but one of the spotlight maps was about how food-related student groups, the language that they used was really alienating to students of color. So there are these very like white-led groups. This has changed a lot since then. This has been a place where I feel like there has been a lot of change. But that's on a kind of an example related to discourse. And then the one relating to rules, when we started the project, only students could access the pantry, but we did a lot of work around the fact that staff needed access to the pantry as well, and I'll go into that a little bit more. But we were really changing the rules around how the organization works, right? So these are examples of people doing this kind of relational work and discursive work and material work to really create changes on campus. I want to introduce a couple other theories that come from social movements and organizational change, and that is around inequality regimes and racialized organizations, right? So universities would never say that they are white supremacist organizations, and they would never say that they are racialized organizations or gendered organizations, but theories that come out of sociology really show that, in fact, they are, because those are the default around how organizations operate in a white supremacist and patriarchal society, right? And so Acker's theory of inequality regimes really first named this, and then Rutten and Kolut, and then also Ray specifically talked about the way the basic functions of organizations are racialized and how that kind of plays out. So how you have to actively work so hard to kind of counteract that. So the Foodscape map revealed many examples of this, and one of the ones that just when it comes to staff basic needs that I'll spotlight is, so food and housing insecurity among Berkeley's lowest paid staff is even higher than rates among the students. And this is custodial and food service staff, right? So these are predominantly women of color who are serving food and cleaning up after students, but they themselves are food and housing insecure. And yet they didn't have access to the pantry before we did this project, because at Berkeley and many other universities, the prevailing cultural norm is that women of color and other low-paid staff should be serving students, right? And that their own basic needs aren't taken into consideration and are not of equal importance. So that's an example of how these kind of unspoken rules are playing out to create racialized and gendered organizations. From social movement strategy, the one that I'll highlight here is around power mapping. This is used a lot in social movements. So power mapping is usually when like you have a campaign like goal identified in advance, and then you're like, this is what we want to accomplish, and then you try to map out who to influence to actually get to that goal, right? So power mapping is used being like, okay, who are all of the people that we need to then like work on to get the rule changed. But what's interesting about this is that usually the goal is set out first, and then it's aimed at creating like a very kind of targeted campaign and looking at who has decision-making power. So, so that is something that is used in social movement theory a lot, that we kind of did the inverse of a little bit. So this is going back to the campus food players map. This is our first map. It was on Post-its, where we are literally trying to identify all of the units on campus, and then the decision makers within all of those units, and how they were all interconnected to each other. And we were not doing it for the purpose of a strategic campaign. We were actually doing it for the purpose of like identification. So we even just knew what was in the campus foodscape, right? We just really wanted to like lay it out, right? So this was a really early version that eventually turned into this one, where we are showing like each one of these expanded. It was basically like the nesting of who reports to who reports to who reports to who. We purposely did it horizontal because students were like, we have power, we don't want it to be this vertical thing, right? So this is sort of a form of power mapping. So before we turn to discussion, I did want to give one example of a more kind of traditional campaign towards organizational change. We did two very kind of serious two-year campaigns. One was around healthy campus food and beverages, which is the one that I'm going to show here, and then one was around staff basic needs, and that's the one that we actually talk about in the book chapter that's coming out in depth. But But this one involved a lot more students. The staff-basic needs one did involve some students, but ended up being a mostly staff-led project. So I wanted to give this example as a student-led project. So the Coalition for Healthy Campus Food and Beverages is what we called to have this very benign name for something that was trying to get rid of the Pepsi contract at UC Berkeley. I think Davis also has an exclusive pouring rights contract, either with Pepsi or Coke. Almost every university in the US does. But this particular kind of mapping project started a couple years, 3 years before the Berkeley's 10-year exclusive contract was supposed to end. And it was something that in early stages of mapping, students really highlighted that this PepsiCo contract, that all of the dining halls and markets on campus had to sell Pepsi products, really went against our values around JEDI. And that both has to do with Pepsi's impact at the world, everything from the sugar-sweetened beverages being targeted, through Pepsi advertising to low-income youth, and specifically in school districts where predominantly students of color, and then also interrupting the political process around where districts were trying to do. So the taxes and Pepsi and these companies were like blocking these and putting a ton of money into it. And then also the environmental impact around the world, including labor, around sugar, everything around plastic. And for me, what was really egregious right on that campus is student athletes who many of, particularly Black students, come to Berkeley through the athletics program are required to have Pepsi logos on their uniforms and do spots, like for football ads with no say in it, right? So there's all these different ways that the Pepsi contract plays out, both very locally on a campus in terms of what beverages we have access to, whose bodies are used to advertise their products, to like global scale. So this was an issue that students were really interested in. And the way we first kind of started approaching it was doing an innovation challenge kind of modeled after the hackathon model, where students for 24 hours got together and like were trying to do a design problem, being like, so the reason that universities have these contracts is they bring in money, right? So Pepsi says, we'll give you $1.3 million every year in return to the exclusive right to your campus. And then often that money goes towards staff positions. And as we know, staff are the hardest thing to find on campus, especially in soft money spaces. So it's like, oh, we need this money because we can't figure out how to like pay people a fucking living wage, and therefore we're gonna like go on, excuse me, that would be a recording, but I don't care. And people are gonna be like coming in and like, we'll give you Pepsi money, and then it's like, oh, we can't eliminate staff positions, right? I get so irate about this as a staff person who was on, soft money for 10 years. So my position was not funded by Pepsi. So we did this hackathon to be like, okay, so how do we address the financial piece that Pepsi does supply with our actual values around food and JEDI? So we did this hackathon that we didn't think we would solve the problem in 24 hours, but it was an opportunity to bring a lot of attention to it. Student groups and all these different departments participated in this panel of judges. Oh, Alistair is second from the end there. So just a shout out, amazing Alistair, PI on this project. We had this panel of faculty and industry experts kind of judging projects. And then what was really interesting is coming out of this is that the judges then were like, hey, Rosalie, want to teach a class on this topic? This is a semester-long project. This isn't a 24-hour project. And I was like, okay. So my semester of grad school, while I was still working close to full time, I taught this semester-long class about the Pepsi contract. The class was really fun. It had 5 undergraduate students and 5 master's students, and that was actually pretty unusual for them to be in a class together and be kind of like equal learners together, and also for the class to be taught by a non-expert. I've never taken a business class in my life to this day. And I really present myself as a co-learner in this project, and we were really using the framing of like wicked problems to solve it. So all these different experts came in. We also, this picture of Joyce getting some gorgeous water. We went to LinkedIn and saw like, how do these big corporate campuses do amazing food and beverages, right? So it was a really fun learning project. At the end of it, we presented, we had 2 teams. One was like a contracts team and one was a no contracts team. And we presented solutions to the team of decision makers who were going to be deciding the project, again, in a big public event to try to build pressure around alternatives. Simultaneously, we did an audit. Joyce Lee, who was a master's student in public health, led this audit. We took photos of every single Pepsi logo on campus and every single beverage like dispensary where you could get beverages, because they kept saying like, we it's mostly water sold on campus. Like, it's like we have this contract, but it's water, it's like healthy, right? It's not just sugary sweet beverages. Well, the results of the audit showed that 56% of the products for sale were in fact sugary sweet beverages, and 67% of the logos. Of note, all of the logos, we did them by like body size, all of the ones that were larger than humans, like a football stadium and our gym. This is our gym. Like, all of those were for sugar sweet beverages. So the smaller ones tended to be for water. So we wrote up a report and sent this around widely. And then, very social movement-y, an undergrad, Selena, who had been on the project for several years. She had actually originally been on the Greek life project, but Selena Melgosa was so inspired by working on this that she started a whole like social media campaign in our undergrad that associated students of UC Berkeley, like the undergrad governance. She created a new office called the Office of Unsustainable Partnerships and led this Pepsi campaign, and they passed a resolution, and she joined the committee with the decision makers and did op-eds and like protests, wrote an amazing report, did this whole thing, right, to try to be like, okay, how do we do this? Well, so pandemic happened and the contract was renewed, which is super shit. We really thought we were gonna win this one, but we didn't. But I still show you this where we were using more traditional campaign strategy. So this really leads to, and I now realize I've taken up so much time, but I will wrap up quickly so we do actually have a bit of discussion. So how do we run the entire project from the beginning, more the way we did these two campaigns? It could be that we would have done more like organizational change, right? But if that was the case, and not that we didn't do any, I don't mean to downplay some very material changes that happened on campus, but if we had done that, we wouldn't have had a student-led thing where these 18 different maps happened that were all based on student interests, where we were like following threads where students were like, this is what's important to me and this is what we're gonna do. We wouldn't have had that kind of critical pedagogy element, right? And it would have been much more of a like narrow focused project. And so Alistair and I are really like spending time thinking about that. Like, is there a way that critical pedagogy and activist research and organizational change can all be pushed forward in particular ways, that all three can happen simultaneously? And that is something that I would love to really hear experiences from the kinds of projects you do or questions that you might ask. These are after the thought questions, right? That we had after wrapping up the project and being like, what did this project do? But had we designed it from the beginning with that question in mind, what might we have done differently, right? So this is where I'd love to spend some time in conversation, and apologies that I got over enthusiastic and sharing about the project and didn't leave as much time for discussion, but here we go.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm jumping in, I don't know who's supposed to jump in.
Should I stop sharing so that we can see?
It's a great question
yeah, that
to leave
sounds
us
good.
with.
Okay, and then
I'll chat and see if anything comes through, but take a moment to absorb everything that was presented, and if you have questions, pop them in the chat. I'm watching for anything that comes through, but also people in the room, feel free to jump in, and we do have extended time with Rosalie here for lunch afterwards, but yeah.
Zoom should have priority.
Burning thoughts.
Since no one is jumping right in, let me just start by asking your thoughts. I mean, there's so much to unpack with that last question, and it's just such a rich presentation. The one thing that I was mulling while you were framing that question was that you have people whose relationship and position within the university are at such different time spans.
yeah.
Staff, professors, students who are moving on.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about the outcomes for those people from a project like this, there's such a different range of outcomes that you might prioritize.
Exactly.
And this is where I really appreciate your critical pedagogy lens and your organizational change lens, because we just think from pedagogically, there's all these learnings that people can take into other spaces that aren't universities.
Right.
And so maybe that's valuable in and of itself, but then of course the desire to change things in this place where people are still having careers.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, maybe I'm just restating what you were saying, but I guess what I'm wondering is that the last example was a course that involved students of different kinds, but what about the staff? And what kind of involvement happened or could have happened if you designed it there with that in mind and thought more about the folks who are a bit more permanent within the institution?
So staff and faculty were very involved in both the Innovation Challenge and the class and the continued campaign. So I want to shout out those amazing people who are still doing, like, they are still working on it, you know. First, the contract was extended by 2 years, and we were like, okay, that's a win because it's the 2 years of the pandemic, and then we'll get folks back on campus and readdress it. But I do want to shout out those folks because we have Kim Gass, who works for University Health Services and the Staff and Faculty Wellness Program. She was really a mentor on the beverage auditing project. Jennifer Falvey, who's here at UC Davis, and you're food science and family, whatever that department is named.
The IIFF or something like that.
She's absolutely amazing. She's an expert on foreign rights contracts. And so she mentored us from Davis and was very involved. Chris Matson and Public Health at Berkeley, Alistair Isles, who's on the environmental side, and we have folks on the business side who are all keeping up the fight and have been involved all along. And part of the strategy of having students take it on is because it's something that the funding goes to students, right? And so having student face of the program, and part of what we kept being told is like, oh, well, students don't care about this issue. So to have students lead the issue was really actually amazing for them, both in terms of leadership performance skills. Selena, who started the Pepsi campaign, then went on to do a master's in public policy at UCLA, but she's just finishing up, where she took this project and ran with it to go on and do a master's, right? So like that is an example of taking the learning elsewhere. But then, yeah, now I think the pandemic broke up the thing of like the Pepsi campaign revitalized, but students weren't even on campus. So like the Pepsi contract was so abstract for 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. And that was 2 years that we really lost the momentum because they didn't even, some students didn't even know like what campus looked like, right? Mm-hmm. But we've tried to, yeah, I stepped out of it to try to finish my dissertation and do other projects. And I probably, if I was still in my staff job, that would have changed things too, right?
The person in your old staff position, have they taken up the cause?
The Foodscape mapping project was one of like kind of multiple things I did in my educational program management position at BFI, and it's not one that has continued. Like that person's been focused on other projects, which, you know, yeah, is fun too. Like this had its big long arc.
Any questions on Zoom? Oh, go ahead, Case.
I'm curious, teaching a class that is meant to challenge and shift the structure and what's happening on campus, what was the overall reception to what y'all were doing? Obviously there were staff who were on board, but was there some resistance from other people's administrators or the other
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I never planned to teach a class, which was kind of amazing. And part of why I told that story is to show how mapping can lead you in these different directions. And it's like all of a sudden this thing happened. But before we did the Innovation Challenge, we spent a good year doing meetings with the people that were the decision makers, whose job literally was to get outside contracts. Like the person whose job it was to make that contract and bring in as much sponsorship money as possible was someone that we wanted to win over, right? But we approached that relationship kind of being like, hey, here's our concerns, but we're in this together, you know? So we did a lot of that kind of relational work that is so key to organizational change. And he was one of the judges in the Innovation Challenge. So by the time we got to the point that we were teaching the class, we had kind of done that groundwork. And the fact that the class, so I can't be a faculty of record as a staff person or a student. And so there was 4 faculty of record in 4 different departments. And so the students in the class, depending upon which major they needed or whether they were masters and undergrad. So we had that. So it was, public health, business, and 2 folks in environmental science were all officially teaching this class, right? And they were resources to students. So yeah, so when we did the kind of final town hall where students presented their project, we, the entire committee that was the decision makers were there in the room, as well as, you know, all these community partners that we had. So like the folks from LinkedIn who had been experts, someone from Google who had been an expert, like came in and they were there. And so that's where we really felt so hopeful. And like, so literally we presented this in December 2019 and then campus shut down like right after that, right? So I don't know where this would have gone. But that's where the relational part of organizational change work is so important, right?
Well, related to the organizational change, I'm thinking about the aspects of this that were very much in a kind of participatory action research mode, where you were not just gathering data about things, but also reframing what a foodscape is, learning together how should we think about a foodscape, whether it's microwaves or drinking fountains. And it seems like one potential measure of success is the degree to which that's no longer necessary as a crowdsourced or grassroots effort, because the institution itself is adopting new framings or shifting its framing and doing that sensing and gathering and reporting as a part of its job. Do you have any outcomes like that where it's like you par yourself out of a job?
Yeah.
And,
Thank you for bringing that up, because yes, and we talk about that in the chapter that's coming in review about this, because like we want to look so if we use this framework of social symbolic, what are the permanent relational changes that happen as a result of this? What are the permanent discursive ones and what are the permanent like material changes that actually result of this project? And I would say that we do have many of those. And one of them is that, for example, staff and postdocs now have full access to the food pantry and are 11% of users. And that is both material change. I also at one point got $140,000 worth of grocery cards. I can tell you about the grocery cards. But during the pandemic, I was bicycling around with Safeway grocery cards. So we were able to get $140,000 from various different departments, including UCPD, to get grocery cards in the hands of essential workers that were food service and custodial staff on campus. That was kind of the thing that happened. So like there are those things. So that is a major change. Do all staff at UC Berkeley now have living wages, which is my measurement of change? No.
Yeah.
So like, right? But some of the other things on the student front, like, the makeup of the food-related student groups on campus has super shifted. Now they all talk about food sovereignty and racial justice and land and blah, 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 blah. And like, we can't just say that that's for the Foodscape Mapping Project. I think that's culture at large. But I do think that there's some influence there. Like, you know, this map is taught in some of the core courses in the food systems minor, so students are exposed to it, you know, in these big undergrad classes. So I do think that some of those things can count as change, you know.
Yeah, that's great. There's a question in the chat here from Mookie. Mookie, would you like to say your question or would you like me to read it?
Oh, really thank you very much, Rosalie, for the presentation and for the discussion. So my question is about the kind of understanding of the system. So the sense, like I've seen that you've done with the student, the mapping of the power relationship in the university system, and also the kind of understanding on what you've shown in the example about Pepsi. So is it correct to say that the students before that didn't have a concept of the system? And I'm interested in that aspect of understanding what's the system that they are inside and did they share it with other students?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. So at Berkeley, our food systems minor is called the food systems minor, and our graduate certificate in food systems, they both use systems in the name. Those are two projects that in my staff life at the Food Institute, I was very involved in creating those programs. We looked at the Davis major, which it focuses more on sustainability, I know in the name, than we use at Berkeley because we're trying to focus on kind of justice in the name in it as well as sustainability. But I would say that students that take those classes get exposed to systems in different ways. A lot of students involved in this project were not food systems minors. Like when I read some of the kind of different departments people were coming from, especially a lot of students who did the data visualization, these were like funky side jobs for data science students. And it was the first time they thought about food or systems thinking, but they had were brought in to illustrate the research that other people were doing, right? So I think for some people, being exposed to systems was a new thing, and how we ended up landing on these different kinds of mapping was to try to build knowledge about what the system was. And that's like this, like kind of creating a space where more and more people thought about campus as a foodscape. And that in itself, again, back to your question, was kind of outcome. And the reason that we limit it to campus, even though in the case of the Pepsi example, you see the connection between campus and, you know, sugarcane plantations in Indonesia, right? Like, we wanted it to be a scale where students felt like they could see the way around what the system was. So about 65,000 people participate in the Berkeley Foodscape daily, between staff, faculty, students, postdocs, visitors. So that's a substantial sized city, right? A small city, but it's one that people can kind of envision because they walk around it. So that's why we limited all of the maps to things that were actually on campus, so that then it could be like kind of a living lab for thinking about bigger systems issues on a scale that people could understand while being a student. I hope that answers your question, or partially at least.
Well, I just wanted to make note of the time. We're a little bit past 11:30, so if you are on the Zoom and need to hop off, please do so. Thank you so much for attending our Collabinar today. It was really great to have you, Rosalie. This is so cool. I have so many questions. And yeah, please join our next Collabinar to be announced. If you are at this webinar, you are probably on the list to get announcements for more. So stay tuned, and thank you so much again for attending.
Thanks. My contact info was on the last slide that I didn't show, but people know how to find me if they need to.